body built anew. Spirit lingers torn in two. Metal fingers grip my heart so cold. Fossil fuels to slavery, political duplicity. Every great commodity's been sold. Slave to the new black gold. There's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Your secret science conquers nature's cruel laws, but inside your wires lie a million mortal flaws. Electric sleep, I dream inside my honeycomb. I stay alive inside my hive of skin and chrome. Broken body built anew. Spirit lingers torn in two. Metal fingers grip my heart so cold. Fossil fuels to slavery, political duplicity. Every great commodity's been sold. Slave to the new black gold. There's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slave to the new black gold. There's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Body built anew. Spirit lingers torn in two. Metal fingers grip my heart so cold. Slave to the new black gold. There's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slave to the new black gold. There's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slave to the new black gold. There's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slave to the new black gold. There's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. built anew. Spirit lingers torn in two. Metal fingers grip my heart so cold. slavery, political duplicity. Every great commodity's been sold. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Your secret science conquers nature's cruel laws, but inside your wires lie a million mortal flaws. Electric sleep, I dream inside my honeycomb. I stay alive inside my hive of skin and chrome. Broken body built anew, spirit lingers torn in two. Metal fingers grip my heart so cold. Fossil fuels to slavery, political duplicity. Every great commodity's been sold. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Body built anew, spirit lingers torn in two. Metal fingers grip my heart so cold. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. built anew. Spirit lingers torn in two. Metal fingers grip my heart so cold. Fossil fuels to slavery, political duplicity. Every great commodity's been sold. black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Your secret science conquers nature's cruel laws, but inside your wires lie a million mortal flaws. Electric sleep, I dream inside my honeycomb. I stay alive inside my hive of skin and chrome. Broken body built anew, spirit lingers torn in two. Metal fingers grip my heart so cold. Fossil fuels to slavery, political duplicity. Every great commodity's been sold. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Body built anew, spirit lingers torn in two. Metal fingers grip my heart so cold. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slave to the new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slip to your new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Slip to your new black gold, there's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. built anew. Spirit lingers torn in two. Metal fingers grip my heart so cold. Fossil fuels to slavery, political duplicity. Every great commodity's been sold. Slave to the new black gold. There's a heartbeat under my skin. Search my electric soul for the hidden man within. Inside your wires lie a million mortal flaws. Electric sleep, I dream inside my honeycomb. I stay alive inside my hive of skin and chrome. Broken body built anew.
Exactly. In desperation, I went and looked there, and I'm like, oh, but okay. And then, as discussed, I'm uncertain if Dr. Plotney, again, anyway, I'm uncertain if Dr. Plotney and Dr. Benson, did you? Anyway, we'll...
I'm going to just forward that email just in case, because, yeah, I do realize that it might have gotten lost in the...
Correct.
Especially if they're not on the... They wouldn't have gotten that email, and that was an oversight on my part.
I get what you mean.
Yeah.
Really? Okay, well, regardless, again, this is slightly different, where all of the committee members have actually already interacted with Jesse and the materials. But this is the open portion of the exam. Let's not test my patience this morning. I'll just mute myself now.
Yep, I just sent it as soon as she sent that as well.
Yes, it was quite hidden in some sense.
Yeah, I completely just overlooked the fact that, yeah, that might happen.
I think we might want to... Should we start? Jesse, did you hear back from Dr. Benson directly?
I had originally, she was fine with this time, but I do realize that having not sent it out because not realizing departmental emails wouldn't go to somebody not in our department.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Perhaps we'll give her a couple minutes.
yeah, that's fine.
I'm not expecting Dr. Quatney. He's already communicated that.
Okay.
Or, I mean, maybe he'll...
I mean, we can record this and just have that available for Dr. Quatney if he so desires.
Yeah, and Dr. Benson, albeit they've, again, already...
Right.
I believe. But anyway.
I'm doing well. What was that? I mean, given the last 2 months, I am doing about as well as could be expected, I guess. Yeah, so it was it's been a journey. I can say that much, and it's, you know, I'm just happy we've reached today.
Dagmar, aren't you? Yes.
Yes.
So,
I guess we can start. So today we have a thesis proposal by Jesse Hill, who's working with Dr. Nero in the area of power distribution systems. Jesse?
Okay. So thank you everybody for coming today. I just want to, I can't thank everybody enough. I know it's been quite a whirlwind of 2 months dealing with everything. I won't go into that here. As always, I'm willing to talk with all of you because, I wouldn't have invited you if you were not important to have here and to share this moment with everybody. So thank you again. Today's presentation is entitled Power Factor Control in Distribution Power Systems with Distributed Energy Resources. Once again, my name is Jesse Hill, and my advisor is Dr. Karen Mew. So, there we go. Okay, so just a quick overview of the presentation. We'll go over the background and motivations, problem formulation, some of the proposed control actions we'll be taking. I have some preliminary results, and then the future work and conclusions will close this out. So just to start off, with a traditional distribution system, more in a classical sense, we're talking about a radial network with...
Jesse, my apologies for interrupting.
No problem.
Recording?
Oh, you're right. I did not hit the record button. Let me see where that is. Please ask the host to give permission to record?
Who is hosting?
because Sean must have made the link.
I thought I had made that.
Oh, did you make it?
Yeah, you need to log in as the host, I guess.
use the Drexel thing.
I mean, I can record in a different sense, so I'll just do that.
You have Camtasia, or how are you going to
Yeah,
record?
I can record that.
Sounds good. Can you start with the static site again very quickly?
Sure. Okay, so take two. So once again, my presentation is entitled Power Factor Control in Distribution Power Systems with Distributed Energy Resources. My name is Jesse Hill, and my advisor is Dr. Karen Mew. So just a short outline, we're going to do some background and motivation about the project. We'll then move on to a brief problem formulation. There will then be a proposed control actions of how we want to, what devices and how we want to control the system. We have some preliminary results based on those ideas, and then we'll go over some of the future work and conclusions based on what we've done so far. So talking about a traditional distribution system, or historically, they are radial networks, so no loops. We have an unbalanced power flow. Typically, we're looking at about 10% or less than 2% unbalance. These are metrics actually set up through the utilities and other standards within IEEE as well. And then we have unidirectional power flow out from a generator to the loads. The future of distribution does look different, however, or current distribution as well. So we're still looking at a radial network. Unbalanced power flow is going to remain, or at least should remain, but what we don't know is exactly how much or if it could even increase. The cited paper there is actually work that was taken up by myself and Zach recently, among others, where we actually looked at some of the imbalance statistics for circuits where renewables were injected or were being placed in the system, and we saw some cases where it would actually increase and others where it would decrease, so it would require further study. And instead of unidirectional power flow, we're looking at a bidirectional power flow at this point. Those sources are starting to backfeed, and even possibly enough renewables to feed back onto the transmission network. So, as I said, why is this? High penetration of distributed energy resources, henceforth DER. So, in terms of the system of itself, what we have are some basic, viewpoints. We've got our utility. We could also look at the transmission and distribution networks separately. The consumers and even third-party operators. These usually have some control or interaction with your consumers, and the or also the RTOs and ISOs, or your regional transmission operators and independent system operators. And these groups all interacting and having some kind of control or working together to manage this power network. Now, what separates all these groups, however, is the amount of information each of them has. Generally speaking, the utility will have the most information in terms of a system perspective, or a, the connections, the loads, the installations, whereas each of the other groups will have probably a little less to work with. So with all these new devices on the system, who should probably control all of them? And that's kind of the question we want to answer here. So from a utility standpoint, if we look at the power system planners, these are groups that traditionally will look at the system construction and the layout, and usually this is a long-term planning process, usually multiple years into the future. Also from the utility side, we have the power system operators. These groups usually look at your system static security. So are the voltages, are the currents within the limits that we require? In terms of the controllable devices, and specifically what we'll be talking about today, we're looking at capacitors, usually an on-off control per bank, and then also the inverter control. So this will be looking at photovoltaics and energy storage, mainly the power factor, although energy storage will introduce a few more factors as well. So where does that leave us? Well, we have new opportunities today in how we want to control the distribution system. we have the ability to look at the power factor of these new power inverters and use these to hopefully, reach better voltage control within the network. The system level operators within the utility actually have the information about the infrastructure to make have an informed approach to the overall plan day-to-day operations. So using their information, how best do we control those devices? How much should we raise or lower them, and how often should we control them? Now we have some previous selected works in this field. The works by Alyami and Ghosh focused on the inverters and specifically looking at capping the amount of power coming out of PV installations. So specifically PV curtailment, and they mostly focused on nodal voltage magnitude limits. Sue then looked at power factor control and had a look to reduce the losses and limit nodal voltages. To do this, they used a weighted sum Pareto optimization. There was a multi-objective optimization that they used to eventually turn to that, and they used sequential quadratic programming as part of their optimization. Works by Siegel, Kleinberg, and Coleman looked at capacitor control, and this was over a dispatch window, specifically trying to limit the operations of the equipment within the system. And they looked to coordinate these devices hour to hour and in trying to come up with a solution to maintain those voltages. Next, we have the works by Dalami. This actually looked at electric vehicles, and what they were looking at was high penetration electric vehicles and trying to coordinate charging over an evening window. With that, they had random arrival times and allowed the customers to determine their own priority for charging, and having a tariff-based system for when you wanted to do your specific charging. Finally, the works by Liu and Shahidipur looked at scheduling of storage over a 24-hour period. This was in conjunction with looking at the locational marginal price, and they had states for the storage between a charging, discharging, and off for that storage, and also looked at line congestion. So moving into the problem formulation, we're going to start with some basic notation. So we have V. This will be our bus/nodal voltages. These are unknown values. U will be our control vector. We're breaking this into two settings for the formulation so far. We have our inverter settings as part of the U1, and then U2 will be our capacitor settings. U1 is mostly power factors for the inverters, while U2 is a on-off setting for our capacitors. Lambda is our system settings. We know these going into it. These will be whether our branches and switches are open or closed, the loading at our nodes, as well as solar injection data. While this is technically an unknown in a sense that we are predicting it, or it's a forecast, we will use historical data throughout. Then we have TF, our number of time windows. As you can see in figure 2, that is just a sample time window. We're not going to say that each window is necessarily going to be an hour. We're going to try to have multi-hour windows, and as a result, some of these will be non-uniform in length. Then and bus, cap, inverter, and branches are the numbers of branches, capacitors, inverters, and lines in the system, respectively. We just will have to enumerate those as we go along. So getting started with the problem formulation, this will be a cost minimization. We're going to put this into 4 different cost equations. We're going to have a cost for the inverter operations, the capacitor operations, the voltage deviation, and as well as the real power losses of the system. We'll now proceed to go over each of these. But first, I just want to talk about the loads and the capacitors in the system. So the loads, we're looking at each bus or node in the system, and for each phase, we want to make sure that the power at that node or going in and going out are equivalent. So for each node, it's going to be a combination of the load, the PV, the capacitor, and battery storage. And then for the capacitors, we just have this as the reactive power being injected into the system through that capacitor from 1 through n caps. For this formulation, we're going with either an on or off setting for the capacitor. Other works do examine the idea that you can actually have multiple levels, usually in steps, as you control individual portions of a capacitor bank. But for this work, we're just going with on-off settings, as that is also part of the equipment available to our project partner. So in terms of the cost functions, first up, we have that inverter cost. So for this, we have some K inverter. Each inverter will have a different cost for the amount, or for each operation on it. And what we'll look at is the amount of change, or the relative change of the power factor setting for each inverter. So in other words, the more you change it, the higher the cost on that. Each inverter will have its own cost. And for this work, we're looking at a range of 0.79 or 0.97 leading or lagging up through 1. And we'll discuss that range later as well. For the capacitors, similar in terms of the K cap value, but we're also going with, for this one, we're not looking at relative change. It's just if we're going from on to off or off to on. As I said previously, this is based solely on an on-off setting. We could consider a change if we were to have more settings available for the capacitors. For the voltage costs, this one's going to be a little bit more complicated. What we're looking at is a deviation from a desired range. Our partner on this project, we were looking at, they have a desired voltage range of 0.97 to 1.03. So anything in that range, we would prefer to have zero cost associated with it. As we get outside that range in the 1.03 to 1.05 or 0.97 to down to 0.95 range, these are okay from a standards point of view, but we would like to correct or incentivize being closer to that middle range. So we'll have a small cost in that range. And then as we get outside that 0.95 and 1.05 range, we really want to disincentivize any reason to be in there. So we'll have higher costs associated with values outside of there. And then finally, for loss cost, we're just going to have a K loss, which will be a dollar per kilowatt hour. And P loss, we'll look at the I squared R value, or the I squared R losses in the system. For problem formulation overall, we're going to have two formulations to look at. So first up, we'll have without storage. This will look like a power flow, as most of you are aware. So we're looking at those equality constraints and inequality constraints. For equality, we're mainly talking about the nodal power flow. And for the inequality, we're looking at operating constraints, mainly voltage, min-max requirements, and line currents. Now, important thing about line currents, because of the fact that we're mainly looking at PV being the new equipment on the system, what we can actually do is remove those current limits. In general, we would expect that the injection of PV onto the system at most levels will actually cause a reduction in the line currents of the system, so we will be able to reject that constraint. However, as we move on to a formulation with storage in the system, we actually cannot remove that constraint anymore. Line currents, we could expect those values to go up or down depending on how the storage is operating. If we're charging those storage devices, we might see increases in the line currents, and thus we would have to be more aware of those going forward. So let's talk about data. So in terms of the system, the stuff that we mainly care about, what do our lines look like? What kind of loading do we have? Where are the capacitors and how big are they? And what kind of PV installations do we have as well? We would then take that information, run it through a power flow, and we get our outputs and some post-calculated values. But let's focus on those inputs and who has what kind of information. Well, in general, our customers, individual customers should be aware nominally of their own load and their own PV if they have it. And they know they can make educated decisions about that. Our third party These groups have maybe some additional topology information, but more so we'll have a look at groups of customers and groups of loading in PV. But generally speaking, they're still going to lack some of the nuance of the full system infrastructure. But as we expand on to the utility, they actually have all of this information available to them. So they know that full system construction. So that's why we're trying to, what we're arguing here is that while third-party companies and customers do have some information, it is only the utility that has all that information to truly make these decisions in how we want to control these devices. So in terms of the power flow output, what we would have is we would perform a power flow. From there, we would do some constraint evaluation. We'll look at mainly our voltage, current, and power limits. And we'll ask ourselves, do any of these rise or fall below the desired ranges? In particular, voltages above or below that max min value. And then, if we have violations, what control actions can or should we take? And even if no violations exist, do we want to take actions? You know, we talked about that range in the 0.97 to 0.95 range. While not a violation from a system security standpoint, we would still hope to be above 0.97. Is it cost effective to make a change? So in terms of the devices, we've been saying we have two to really focus on. We have our inverters and our capacitors. Inverters have the ability to both consume or inject reactive power into the system. How? Through the power factor, we're able to set that to either leading or lagging. And what we want to argue is that network control here from that top at the utility allows them to kind of analyze how each customer's change affects everybody else. Utility already does have some of that control in terms of the capacitors. These are strictly, though, injections of reactive power into the system that you are controlling by either turning those capacitors on or off. So let's talk about the inverters a bit. I said earlier I want to have a range of 0.97 to 1.0 that's leading or lagging. We did testing using a 0.01 step size, and I'll show the data with that a little bit later. But I want to push this to actually smaller at 0.001. In general, what we're looking at is a lower power factor. It decreases the amount of real power injection into the system, but it also increases the reactive power that we're getting out of that. So what we want to do is we want to have a balance between these two numbers. But why do we want to decrease from a smaller size and increase the problem size? Well, a smaller step size does give us the ability to tailor our outputs a little bit more specifically. Plus, realistically, if you look at that range that we're talking about from 0.97 to 1.0, going from 1.0 down to 0.97 is only about 5% reduction in your real power output, while on the reactive power side, it's actually a 25% increase in reactive power. So we're really looking at small changes to real power for large growth in our reactive power control. Next up, we have some proposed control schemes. So when, where, and how do we make those changes? Well, I'm going to look at two methods here. We're going to talk about geography and sensitivity analysis. They're going to sound similar, but they're going to have different implications going forward. So first up, we have geography. If you're familiar with a Z-bus, this will seem related, but it's more of, I'm calling it a Z-graph. What you're going to look at is the direct impedance between two nodes. The reason that we can look at this is that the network is technically nodal, or sorry, not nodal, it is radial. So there won't be a loop between those two spots. So for example, if we're going to look at buses 2 and 3 here, the Z-graph will tell us that the impedance between those two would be Z12 plus Z13. So we're pretty much just building a total impedance between those two nodes of the system. For the sensitivity side, we're actually going to look at the system Jacobian. So the Jacobian is a way to relate real and reactive power changes to changes in specifically bus voltage. So This system or this method will use the voltages and currents of the system as well as the actual current system construction in determining those sensitivities. Now, in terms of what these look at and which would be best to choose, let's start with geography. Generally speaking, a low impedance would suggest that there is going to be increased change due to changes in the power. The pro here is that generally this is a simplified calculation. We're really we have that system construction and we're maintaining it throughout. The con to this though is while we would hope it suggests an increased dependence, we can't say that for sure. Power distribution systems and power systems in general are nonlinear and thus have a more complicated nature that might not be covered here. Sensitivity, however, we can see that, or we can believe that kind of change. Higher values there do also suggest that changes in power will have greater effects on the voltage. So we have that showing through that Jacobian. The con here, though, is the added calculation requirements. Each iteration or each change to the system will require a refresh of that Jacobian matrix. And I'll show a system later where, we're talking thousands of buses in the system, and as these systems continue to grow from there, how much do we want to redo the calculations on the Jacobian? So here is that circuit. This is just one of a few test circuits that we'll be working on. This one's in particular, 1,588 buses, over 2,200 nodes. There are 6 capacitors in this system. It is all color-coded. I realize that it's very hard to see the detail in this one. Some just basic information as well. We're talking about 3,400 kilowatts of load and about 1,900 kVAR. This is not the peak loading of this system either. This is what we refer to as a base load, or about 70% loading. So this is pretty average for the system. And there are 14 existing PV. I'll show those next. So we have those 14 existing PV. It has a total rating of over 4,000 kilowatts. And there is 910 kilowatts total right now of active generation. Of that 70% loading, that's about 26.8% of it. And you have a list here. A lot of residential units, but we also have one commercial unit. I will say that while that rated power versus power delivered is very lopsided to appear that it is a very inefficient unit, I will say it is. There is some reasoning behind that. So just so you're aware. In terms of the capacitors in the network, we do have 6 of those. 4 of them are 3-phase. 2 of them are single-phase capacitors. In terms of the 3-phase, we have 2,700 kVAR total on the system. We also have 600 of that, or 600 additional kVAR on phase A. Initial testing of the power flow, this is before we added in the PV, showed high voltage on phase A as well as low voltages on phase C. Removing the 2 single-phase capacitors actually completely removed all those overvoltage and undervoltage violations. Now, these are particularly outside of the 0.95, 1.05 range. Even after those removals, we still had some outside of the 0.97, 1.03 bound. But in terms of at least basic system security, we were able to fix those. So then we moved on to some information about our no PV and existing PV. So as you can see, this kind of, on the left, this details a bit more closely the information presented on the previous slide. As you can see, those low voltages on the C phase we have as 0.96, and that high on A phase at 1.037. So we are outside of those ranges. You also get a basic idea for the losses. After PV has been added in, you do see the reduction in our real power losses. We had about a 3% reduction there. A reduction of substation real power injected into the system of about 900 kilowatts. We do have actually a reduction in, or the low voltage on C phase does go down a little bit. and our A phase voltage also increases. So at this point, we have 357 nodes outside of that 0.97 to 1.03 range, or we had before PV, and then with PV, that number actually grows to 416 nodes. In terms of the loading, we're going to look at this project as part of a planning experiment as well. So looking at the loads, we have 682 load installations. Some of these are actually, we have 602 non-zero, 17 three-phase, 5 two-phase loads, and then the single-phase loads are divided 195 on A, 162 on B, 223 on C. In terms of the load growth, we're going to expect about a 0.5% load growth year to year on this. This is a rough estimate that most utilities would use going forward. Now, the other piece of this is looking at PV expansion. We're looking at high density PV coming online in the future. So what we're going to look at here is, so you can see here about 30% growth year to year, or from the previous year of the residential. We're going to talk about a 250 kilowatt growth year to year on the commercial industrial. And we're not actually going to have any solar farm additions for this set of testing. But what you'll see is that within a few years, and specifically even on the circuit that we're going to talk about, you know, within that 10-year horizon, we're talking about PV outpacing the load, and that we should very quickly have PV greater than the total loading of the system. So just looking at this, residential installations, we're talking about 10 kilowatt installations. The commercial industrial is going to be those 250s, and the solar would be, or the large solar farms, 1 megawatt. Some assumptions that were made, we're talking about only 1 PV per location. So we're specifically only, you know, we're going to limit our decision space to those. So year 0, 14 existing installations, so that was 26.8%. By year 10, we're talking 250 installations and 159% of our total load. So you see here, just looking at running those power flows year to year, year 0 was the data we first presented. Year 10 is the end, and year 7, you actually see that crossover where our actual substation power is now negative, so we're actually backfeeding into the transmission network. And we do see that significant reduction in total P losses. So in terms of the voltages, so here you can see that we do have those max voltages. We don't have any violations throughout the total 10-year period. But on the minimum voltage violation, or sorry, the maximum voltage violations, we actually do have values going over the 1.05 range by year 8. But even within year 7, which is right before or right on that cusp, we still have 509 nodes outside of our desired range. So to kind of combine the ideas that we've been talking about up to this point, how can we control this? What steps can we take? So first, we just decided if we look solely at inverter control. So let's take all of our phase A inverters, because that's where all of our maximum voltage violations are, and let's adjust all those numbers. You know, let's take those and go to the extreme of 0.97 lagging power factor. So these inverters are going to consume reactive power. What happens to my minimum and my maximum voltages? Well, surprisingly, in some sense, the min rose, and so did the maximum voltage. We actually had more voltage violations as a result of this change. And this kind of goes back to the idea of a distribution system being nonlinear and not being able to make those kinds of assumptions. That, you know, it's, you know, just so simple to make a change here or there. So what we instead did was we looked at that same set, but also examined the capacitors. So we looked at the locations of where our capacitors are. We looked at the locations of our voltage violations. And what we saw is that we also could adjust the those capacitors. So in this case, there was a capacitor, a three-phase capacitor at the bus labeled as 2235. We turned that off. Now, at year 0, this was a problem because removing that capacitor actually introduces voltage violations. But what we did see is that removing it also got rid of a lot of our maximum voltage violations. Not all of them, but a lot. However, if we then also incorporate the power factor adjustment to all of our phase A inverters, the combination of those two is actually able to get below the 1.05. We're still above the 1.03 target that we would have set out, but we've been able to get rid of the major violations in terms of the static security of the system. We repeated these studies with some additional system. We looked to incorporate the distribution substation transformer. This was more on the background side of things. I'm not going to detail this as much as we did previously, but we got similar results making those changes. So what have we done so far? Well, from the power flow, we worked to get a method to remove loops in the system. Technically, the data we receive has a lot of switches, and those would technically create loops. So we developed a method to get rid of the loops in the system, and also co-developed a method for introducing PV expansion into the system. In terms of control, we tested the settings for inverter and capacitor control. And we developed 2 heuristics to determine which ones we actually want to control going forward. We were currently using observation of the system topology. And then for results, we found some initial results showing promise in a combined capacitor inverter approach. And we enumerated the solutions showing the need for that coordination. In terms of the future work that we need to complete, we need to automate this process. First, we need a way to determine the limitations and actually stopping criteria, whether this is number of iterations or the amount of improvement we can actually see going forward. And then what we also want is to implement some code to automate the decision process. So which capacitors, which inverters or storage, and how much change do we want to make to those settings. Additionally, I want to incorporate storage. I've been working a lot on storage up to this point in my PhD career. So we want to incorporate storage into the system. It's going to have a similar construction to the inverter control we discussed, but we'll have to look at additional temporal elements in terms of the state of charge. This is both inequality and equality constraints depending on how you work at that, and we'll have a uniform versus vary time window length will determine how much power is going in or out. As I said, this will borrow a lot from some of my previous works. So I have just a few of those listed here. That last paper with everybody listed there was actually that one on imbalance factors as well that I had mentioned. So in conclusion, we outlined the methods for cost minimization for controlling the devices. We provided 2 control heuristics for selecting how and where to take action. We simulated some initial results based on those heuristics, or based on those control methodologies, and then we showed a roadmap going forward to reach completion on this thesis. Here are just some of the select references. And at this point in time, thank you all for attending, and if there are any questions, I am free to answer them.
So at this point, as Jesse said, we are opening the floor for questions from the audience. Any questions? Come on, guys, be brave.
Can I clarify one tiny little thing from I think the 3rd slide on Jesse's? It's just the 2 volts imbalance is 2 volts imbalance at the substation. The distribution networks can be much more unbalanced than 2% downstream. Sorry, I didn't want anybody in the public to leave thinking that our systems are only within 2% imbalance. That's not true. But at the substation, that is the target. Sorry, just educational purposes here.
Hey Jesse, I
Hey,
have
Keith.
a few questions.
Sure.
Great job, by the way. Very
Thanks.
informative. So I forget what slide, but you mentioned that in year 10, when you were going through the various years for the forecasting, that PV would supply 224% of the load. Is that? Can you explain that a little bit? Is that the peak generation of solar compared to the peak load, or compared to the load at that peak time? Or how's that 224 calculated?
So that number was based on taking the base loading, those 70% numbers, and relating that to roughly the solar output we would expect. So the base loading we took was where we put. So if I guess I'll make it clear with this one, hopefully, is if you look at those power capacities of our PV, those are the numbers that were used to, like, that 5, 5, 10, 10. That power injection was used alongside the 70% loading. So we're really comparing to that 70% number.
Okay, gotcha. And then for the base load, how did you forecast what the base load how the base load would change year over year?
So we actually looked at some. This is common, or more of a common growth metric used by a lot of utilities in planning. They assume usually about a 0.5% load growth year to year. There are some reports that could consider, 1% or 2% load growth, but generally speaking, 0.5% is what they look at.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was curious because at the beginning you mentioned the paper on electric vehicle charging and the scenarios with the projected high penetration of electric vehicles. Yeah,
and that's one of those things that, we will have to examine going forward, especially as, I think that 0.5% number could become almost outdated in a sense if growth in the electric vehicle or even storage in general outpaces that, and we see much larger changes.
Cool. Thanks, Jesse.
You're welcome.
All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
Jesse, in your preliminary results, you were detailing the inverter and capacitor control from a year-to-year basis. For the optimization problem that you detailed, is your intention to still look at it over a year-to-year basis, or are you going to be looking at a smaller time scale? I guess I just want to know what time scale you're going to be considering here.
So on that side of things, like, we'd have to look at each year almost as its own window in a sense, because, like, I would have to focus in on a year and do a time window examination of that particular window and then move on to a different year. Because obviously, our settings would have to change year to year even. You kind of see that with that year 0 versus year 7 comparison at the end, where settings that are common today are not going to be necessarily valid in year 7. This goes back to the idea that a lot of these installations were made with the present in mind and some change to the future. But given the large changes we're seeing in the next 10 years, we'll have to look at these on almost a case-by-case basis.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? If there are no other questions, I would like to ask the general audience to leave. And we are going to continue the discussion with the committee without the public. Thanks everybody for coming, and hope you have a dry day.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you.
Bye, Jesse. Good job.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Jesse.
Mr. Hill, I think this is the moment to log off.
He might have stepped away, for all I know. He's at work, so.
Alternatively, what we can do is, Jesse, if you stop the recording now, we can go to my Zoom office. And I can record them.
That's fine as well. So I guess we'll just end on this end, and we can join that.
Does it matter if Mr. Hill hears?
Nope.
Oh, look.
He's gone. Okay.